I've inserted a cube, and I'm going to remind you, you can go to Game Object, 3D Object for simple shapes. And I want to talk a little bit more about game objects and the properties for them that you see in the inspector panel in this little recording. So let me start by just selecting my cube, and then I'm going to go over and name it. The scene's basically listing game objects that I've already placed, and also some things like the camera and light. And then I got a grip on naming. Earlier, I was double clicking it, which actually is changing the view. Let me zoom out. But I think it's a better practice. Maybe I'm going to call it double clicking more slowly. You can click once to choose the object, and then wait a second, and then click a second time, and then it's highlighted to name it. So I'm just going to call this one hero number 2. And when I select any of these game objects that are in my scene view, you're seeing a lot of properties on the right. So I want to focus on that closer. This is called the inspector panel. And if you really look closely, the properties are grouped into categories which are called components. So for example, there's a transform component, cube mesh component, controlling the shape, and then there's a mesh renderer. So these are kind of almost like categories of properties, but they're really called components. The bolder ones are the components themselves. So this one actually has 4. It has transform, cube for the mesh filter, mesh renderer, and box collider component. And it's kind of interesting that you can even change the shape of the object, that when you inserted a cube, maybe a better way to think of it is that your game object that you name is kind of a container, like an empty container for all kinds of different components that add different characteristics or features. Like for example, transform is in charge of measurements. Renderer is more about the appearance. It's a place to deal with lighting and materials. And cube mesh filter, that mesh component is controlling the actual shape. So again, the object you inserted is really, the game object is really an empty container, and you attach components to it to add properties, to do different things. Just as an example, I'm going to go under cube mesh filter and show you that you can click here to open up a list, and you can change the shape. For example, I could assign a sphere mesh to this particular game object, hero number 2. And by the way, you see the name of the game object at the top of the inspector when it's selected. So it's another reason it is really important to be organized and name all of your objects that you're placing, so you don't have just a list that's very generic, like cube, cube, cube. Then you can track better what you're working on. So again, for example, I can select this. It doesn't really matter that it was initially inserted as a cube. A better way to describe it is it's a game object called hero 2. And by attaching a sphere mesh or other meshes, I can control the visual shape of it. This is also showing assets that have been used earlier in this project. By the way, when I started, there was a construction default scene provided with this template. So just one comment, they're also showing objects under here that are included in that sample asset. So, but I also can switch it to the basic shapes like cylinder, capsule, cube, or the sphere. And I think for the moment, I'm going to actually take it back to the cube mesh. So it's again interesting that even the shape of it is technically a component called a mesh filter, and it can control the visual shape, and that can be changed after the fact. It's pretty interesting. Each component can be collapsed or expanded to see the properties inside as you're working. And there's a few patterns. Each one has a little icon you can click for reference. There's a little question mark there. And I clicked that earlier, and it's basically taking you to pages in the manual for Unity. So it's actually not bad as it's opening specific sections based on where you click the little question mark. So that could be a useful way, again, to get documentation, pull up information, and read about different components while you're working. And then there's also 3 little dots next to each component name that brings up a menu. Like just for example, I can select this cube, and I'm in the move tool right now, and I can start to work in the scene view area. You know, I could just push and pull the different handles as one way to move this. But I want to draw you back over here. Transform is recording my movements. So if we look closer, if I'm moving the X handle for the X axis, you can see the measure recorded there. And based on the origin point, which is 0, it'll use positive numbers for one direction and then negative for the opposite direction, by the way. And you also have measurements being recorded as I move these handles along other axes. Like in Unity, the y-axis takes you up or down. So you can see me manipulating that, and then it's also changing the measurement. I want to start to point out that you can enter values in here, and that might be really helpful to get more precision. It's actually really difficult, I think, to do something like just line up this object precisely. Like if I start to, I'm dragging with the right mouse button to pivot. Maybe I'll drag again and hit a few shortcuts to move around, like W, or rolling the mouse button is moving me closer. I'm going to press the right mouse button again and hit more keys to just adjust the view a little bit. And no matter how much you scoot around, in my opinion, you're never going to get things to line up perfectly unless you start using measurements. Let me kind of scoot out a little bit. So for example, I could select the floor I created earlier and start to look at position and scale information. And that could help me make decisions about where to place another object. So just to give an example of maybe trying to align objects by working more with measurements, I think I'll select the floor and make a few changes. I had scaled earlier, but you can see the numbers kind of not precise measurements. So first, I think this might be easier if I make the scale exactly 0.5. That's sort of the height of the floor. It's half of its original unit. It's a little bit off the sort of floor of the world. Its position is 0.11. Sometimes using simpler measurements is going to make measuring things and aligning easier. So maybe I'll actually use 0 to make sure the floor itself is sort of like touching the ground in the world. And I know its size by looking at the scale. Therefore, if I want this cube to touch the floor, I could select the cube and change its position to 0.5. It's basically the height of the floor. So you can work more with exact positions and measurements if you start to work more with your values over here. You know, 0.5 was actually dipping down a little bit, so I experimented a little bit, and I'm not sure why my math is off, but 0.75 I think is fitting better. And I'm going to go ahead and select the other object and change its Y value to match to bring it up to. I think you get the idea that you can achieve precision and work with relative measurements more easily by starting to use values over here and being more sensitive to different sizes. And transform is just one category. And to kind of get you used to working with this panel, I want to draw you back to the little menu to look for options. And there's all kinds of useful things in here. You can copy measurements like position or scale, paste that into another object. You can also find reset if you want to get back to the original settings at the time I inserted it. Like in this case, if I reset, it's taking the cube back to the original scale of 1 and all the position and rotation numbers are 0. So it's not bad if you want to just start over with something and move it back to the original point of origin. And don't forget, you can undo. I can use Control Z like Zebra on Windows or Command Z on Mac if you want to undo. So just by undoing, I've restored some of the measurements I had there earlier. And there may be occasions where you need to add more components. So I want to just start to demo that there's an add component option at the bottom. And I think what I'll do is remove a component and just add it back in as a demo. So for Box Collider, I'm going to go over to the right on its menu. And I just want to point out there's a remove component option for each component that you have here. And you can also use add to add new components or place that one back in. And just as a quick demo, I'm going to hit add component. You'll see categories here. And the one I deleted is considered physics. It deals with how objects move when we're working in Unity. So I'm going to go into the physics category and just choose Box Collider to add that one back in. And I'll have a recording on physics later to give you more information on that and a lot of the other properties. But at the moment, I want you to kind of get the big picture that, again, these game objects are actually kind of technically empty containers. And you're going to work with components to add visual things like measurements, the shape, materials, lighting, but you will also add things like physics that control how it behaves in the game. And you will have all kinds of components to add different types of kind of actions. For example, you can add audio. So it's not just visual properties. There's other things you can control through components.